Everyone here. My name is Amy Lightford. I'm a professor of art history at Occidental, and I'm incredibly happy to be able to introduce our speaker tonight, Sami Siegelbaum, who is an incredible art historian and a scholar. Sami is going to be speaking to us tonight about a really interesting project that's part of some new work that he's doing, but I want to just tell you a little bit about his biography. He has a BA from NYU, an MA, and a PhD from UC Irvine in visual studies. He's been doing some really interesting work over the last number of years, including, let me turn my page here, including most recently a lecture on the Situationists against the Spectacle, which comes out of the work he did in his dissertation. Live Workspace, Chris D'Arcangelo's Functional Constructions at LACMA, and he chaired a panel at the College Art Association meeting in Los Angeles last year on design and neoliberalism, aesthetics, and the politics of total design across the disciplines. So for those of you who are in the audience who are Oxy students, I really hope you'll begin to get excited about the possibilities of Sami's practice and following his scholarship. I also want to just say that the project he's going to be speaking to us about today really is part of a larger project that focuses on the intersections between art and labor since the 1960s, and a project that really is interested in how artists in the late 70s and early 80s responded to the financialization of the U.S. economy. So without further ado, please help me welcome Sami Siegelbaum.
Thank you for that introduction, Amy, and thank you so much to Nadia for inviting me here. And thank you all for coming. This talk is actually pretty fortuitous in, I hope, a few ways, but for one, Agnes, the artist, the work that I'm going to talk about tonight, has her first major retrospective that just opened today in New York at the Shed. So there's an article in the New York Times, which somehow I missed today. In any case, yeah, I'm sure there's going to be a lot of reviews and talk about her work. And you know, she's someone who has been a figure that has gotten attention and had some degree of success, but I think has been generally overlooked in the histories of the legacies of land art and eco art and site-specific sculpture, some of these terms and movements that I'll be referring to a little bit tonight. So it's great that she's finally getting more recognized and getting her due. So I'm going to do this like sort of lame academic thing a little bit where I read from a text that I've already written, but I'm hoping that, first of all, it'll be interesting, but that afterwards we can have a discussion about some of the issues that I'll be raising, but also try to think about how some of the things that I'll be talking about in relation to Wheatfield, which is obviously in New York in the early 1980s, might relate to some issues that are happening in this city and other works that sort of operate in its legacy. So just to kind of think about that, keep that in mind as I'm talking about this piece. So, as an awkward adolescent growing up amidst the endless fields of corn, wheat, and soy of the Midwest, I constantly dreamed about my future escape to the big city. And really there was only one big city that existed for me. I'm sorry to say it was New York. In my imagination, New York was the absolute antithesis to everything I found restrictive and monotonous about the Midwest. New York was the site of excitement, of danger, of sophistication. Above all, it was the site of culture, or at least a particular idea of culture for which I yearned and which seemed virtually absent from my daily landscape in mid-Michigan. At some point, I bought a poster of the lower Manhattan skyline for my bedroom wall, the Twin Towers surrounded by a fortress-like arrangement of glass skyscrapers gleaming in the sun's last rays. I found this online, but I'm pretty sure this is actually the exact poster image that I have in my room. I hadn't chosen it because I was particularly invested in that specific part or image of New York. It was merely the only option at the store for a poster depicting my beloved city. I only had the barest inkling of what went on in that part of Manhattan, and I certainly wasn't aware that the very site of those impossibly reflective buildings clustered in front of the World Trade Center had about a dozen years earlier been occupied by precisely the sort of thing that I was desperate to leave behind, the Wheatfield. Even more ironically, the Wheatfield in question was a work of contemporary art, exactly the kind of culture I thought didn't exist in the Midwest. In May of 1982, artist Agnes Dennis, along with 2 assistants and a handful of volunteers, planted a nearly 2-acre field of wheat on land reclaimed along lower Manhattan's Hudson River waterfront. Over the course of the next 4 months, Dennis and her volunteers irrigated, fertilized, weeded, sprayed, and finally harvested the wheat. The work, Wheatfield, A Confrontation, was commissioned by the Public Art Fund, an organization founded in 1977 to finance contemporary art in public space in New York. In a statement issued at the time, Dennis wrote, "Planting and harvesting a field of wheat on land worth $4.5 billion created a powerful paradox. Wheatfield was a symbol, a universal concept. It represented food, energy, commerce, world trade, and economics. It referred to mismanagement, waste, world hunger, and ecological concerns. It called attention to our misplaced priorities." The paradox Dennis mentions appears at first to be the result of the confrontation in the title and made visually palpable in the striking photos of the work. The surreal contrasts between a placid field of golden wheat and the imposing facades of skyscrapers looming over it, or between iconic features of the urban environment and the agricultural ground they seem to float above. Certainly a large part of the work's effect has been the way it lent itself to images that juxtaposed elements normally thought to be opposed. So there's clearly a host of symbolic and cultural associations to features that the work places in contrast with one another. The field of wheat evokes a timeless pastoral idea of rural America, amber waves of grain, the bounty of nature, whereas the backdrop of skyscrapers connotes the hustle and bustle of the metropolis, with the World Trade Center, barely a decade old by 1982, a particularly potent symbol of the financial might of Wall Street, New York City, and the United States. As one recent assessment put it, quote, "The provoking work contrasted urban and rural, finance and agriculture, manual labor, and artistic value." Additionally, the photo with Dennis standing in the middle of the shimmering field holding a staff looking like some goddess of the harvest introduced a gendering of these contrasts between the flowing horizontality of the field and the rigid verticality of the buildings. Dennis's description of the work further implied such associations by claiming that it, quote, "pit the congestion of the city of competence, sophistication, and crime against the open fields and unspoiled farmlands, the peaceful and content against the achiever, the everlasting against the forever changing, culture against grassroots, progress versus an existence without stress, the stone city against soft rural land, simplicity versus shared knowing." Shrewd knowing. What happens then if we consider what a field of wheat meant in 1982, not just in opposition to the city and New York's financial district in particular, but in relation to it? That is, does the state of the city at that moment have anything to do with the state of agriculture or art at that time? Because though Wheatfield clearly staged a set of contrasts or confrontations, it did so at a moment when the oppositional nature of those confrontations was being surmounted and displaced by an immense process of abstraction, the abstraction of finance capital. Now I'm going to start with the city in order to address one side of the paradox Dennis mentions, that the rubble-strewn land on which she had planted her wheat was worth $4.5 billion. That figure referred to the then recent valuation of the 92-acre landfill area, of which Wheatfield occupied, as mentioned, about 2 acres. This was area created with the material excavated during the construction of the World Trade Center, which had begun in 1966, and which had been part of a major redevelopment of New York's financial district over the course of that decade. To make a long and complex story short, in the 1960s, New York was transitioning from an industrial city with a large manufacturing base into a center of finance, a local instance of broader changes in the US and world economy. This didn't happen all of a sudden, but it felt pretty fast. There were many factors and causes, but one that had an almost immediate impact on New York City and Lower Manhattan specifically was containerization, the standardization and automation of freight transport. It's fair to say that more than any other invention of the 20th century, the shipping container hastened the rise of globalization. Today, over 90% of global trade involves maritime container ships. The world's first container port opened in Port Elizabeth, New Jersey in 1956, and within a few years it had completely decimated New York City's shipping ports and many of the factories that were in close proximity to them. The effects were particularly palpable along Lower Manhattan's waterfront, which by the late 1960s had become an abandoned stretch of crumbling piers. So you can see, basically the entirety of like the Lower Manhattan Island was covered, ringed with shipping piers. The city rezoned Lower Manhattan from industrial to commercial, enabling the demolition of idle manufacturing spaces and the construction of towering modernist glass and steel skyscrapers to house the operations of the growing FIRE industries. FIRE standing for finance, insurance, real estate is the term that economists use for this sector of the economy. The World Trade Center being the most obvious example. The piers along the Hudson River were removed and the island was extended in their place with the dirt, sand, and debris from the World Trade Center site. In 1968, the city drafted ambitious plans for a futuristic megastructure with subsidized low-income housing plans on the landfill area to be called Battery Park City. Such a project was indicative of the post-war model of urbanism, whereby planners envisioned the environment to be built at a grand scale that would be suited to the needs of the economy and alleviate social problems. The timing for such a project, however, could not have been worse, because a consequence of the very forces of deindustrialization that had led to the creation of the landfill was the erosion of the city's tax base, as manufacturing jobs disappeared and mostly white middle-class residents fled to the expanding suburbs. The city increasingly resorted to borrowing from the banks to meet its fiscal obligations. These included an array of public social services and expenses that today sound like a Bernie Sanders wish list, including mass transit, public housing, the nation's largest school system, free higher education, rent control, robust union contracts, and major infrastructure projects. In the spring of 1975, the banks cut the city's line of credit and President Ford refused to bail out. This is the famous headline, "Drop dead." He didn't actually say those words, but the sentiment was clear. This seemingly left only one solution, to make drastic cuts to the city budget. Unions agreed to buy up city bonds, contracts were renegotiated, wages frozen, services slashed, public hospitals shuttered. Roughly a fifth of the city's workforce was laid off, including thousands of police, firefighters, and teachers. Transit fares were raised, and tuition was imposed for the first time in the city University of New York. Of course, many municipal projects were put on hold or drastically modified. No construction had yet begun at the Battery Park City site by 1979, when the city, at the risk of defaulting on the bonds issued to fund it, gave up ownership and control of the land to the state. The original plans were scrapped, and with them, any provisions for low-income housing. A new plan was created that would be, quote, more attractive for investment. It extended the existing Lower Manhattan street grid into the new neighborhood, thus allowing for private developers to design their own lots and avoid the city's regulations. Tax incentives were offered to develop office space and market-graded housing. Art historian Rosalind Deutsch, writing in 1988, noted the irony of Battery Park City's history. A public fiscal crisis caused by private capital flight was used by the city and the state to publicly subsidize private development for wealthy residents. This history is an underappreciated aspect of the gentrification so often decried in many American cities today. In fact, it's basically an essential component of what we think of as the history of gentrification in this country. Artists and pour-over coffee joints are much further downstream, from the policy decisions made in response to the effects of deindustrialization in the 1960s and 70s. As newly created state-owned land, Battery Park City's development was somewhat different than the typical gentrification narrative of neighborhood disinvestment, decline, then reinvestment. There was no working class residence yet in Battery Park City to displace. Yet the mechanisms and effects were the same. The fact that the project relied on the revenue supplied by corporate office space and luxury apartments rather than low-income housing for viability demonstrates the ways in which governments at the local, state, and national levels were made subordinate to the dictates of capital. But the point I want to make here is that capital changed during the 1970s in the United States from being concentrated in manufacturing, that is, the actual production of goods, to being concentrated in finance. This shift is what is referred to as the financialization of the economy. It happened as a response to the squeeze on corporate profits in the US during the 1970s, caused primarily by increased international competition and the power of American labor unions. Though industrial commodity production continued to expand globally, aided by things like containerization, profits were increasingly accumulated via the ownership or transfer of stocks, debt, derivatives, and other financial instruments. This was accelerated in the 1980s as President Reagan began deregulation of the financial industry, allowing all banks to speculate in commercial real estate. This is why a pile of sand on the edge of Manhattan was valued at $4.5 billion in 1982, less than 7 years after the city was on the brink of a financial crisis. With Wheatfield, it was precisely this financial speculation in undeveloped real estate that was counterposed to the immediate use of the land for growing the crop. Dennis herself claimed that, quote, to attempt to plant, sustain, and harvest 2 acres of wheat here, wasting valuable precious real estate, obstructing the machinery by going against the system, was an effrontery that made it a powerful paradox I had sought for the calling to account. Critical responses to the work have echoed this formulation. For example, seeing it, for example, as, quote, a powerful paradox that questioned existing expectations of use for that valuable real estate, or, quote, a poignant alternative to the horrors visited on a world ruled by the pursuit of money and power. Such readings implicitly acknowledge the growing prominence of finance as an important historical and spatial context for the work. However, by dualistically opposing that context to the agricultural content of the work, such interpretations overlook the ways in which agriculture too, and wheat specifically, was becoming financialized at that moment. Again, to simplify a complex story, between about 1950 and 1970, agriculture was industrialized. This happened on a global scale as scientific developments like chemical fertilizers and pesticides, development of high-yield wheat cultivars, and mechanization dramatically increased tillable acreage and yield. You can see that the area harvested globally remained relatively the same, but yield was much higher. Significant yields here. This so-called Green Revolution had enormous effects around the world, particularly in developing countries emerging from colonialism. It was implemented by the US government, corporations, and foundations to stem the appeal of communism. Within the US, it prompted the consolidation of smaller farms into larger ones as wealthier farmers who could afford to invest in the new technologies bought up the farms of their less wealthy competitors who couldn't. It also encouraged monoculture, large areas of cropland devoted to a single staple crop, usually corn, soy, or wheat. It's literally impossible to overstate the socio-political, economic, and environmental effects of the Green Revolution. However, for our purposes, I'd like to highlight economic, as it pertained to the value of wheat by the 1980s. The increased productivity and size of farms in the United States, combined with containerization, fueled the export market for American wheat. When Reagan became president in 1981, he sought to deregulate agriculture as he did the financial industry. This included cutting subsidies and encouraging further export-oriented production to offset the ballooning trade deficit. farmers overwhelmingly voted for Reagan over fellow farmer Jimmy Carter, in part because of Reagan's promise to end Carter's grain embargo against the Soviet Union. However, high interest rates depressed smaller farm investment, making only large-scale monoculture farms catering to the global market viable. This, combined with financial deregulation, fueled the leveraging of new forms of speculation in the financial industry, such as the derivative swap, in which a floating market price for a commodity is hedged against an agreed-upon fixed price. In this arrangement, a commodity, say wheat, isn't even physically transferred between the parties involved. It's merely the underlying asset of the exchanged cash flows. This caused the value of wheat to rapidly fluctuate by the 1980s, as speculation in wheat futures via such instruments contributed to the growing concentration of wealth in the financial sector. I'm not an economist, but when I see a line going like that, it means it's fluctuating. So just to interpret that for me. Where did these enormous profits on Wall Street go? Where did the investors, traders, money managers, hedge funders, and other speculators put the vast sums of cash they were making during this period? Well, a good chunk of it went into real estate in places like New York City, creating a boom that both catapulted property values and homelessness in the city. Some of it also went into art, igniting an art market that had been sluggish to non-existent in New York during much of the 1970s. Saleable art objects, particularly painting, benefited most obviously from this bull market. And these are just two examples of artists, painters who became very sought after during this period in the New York art market. It was particularly this style of what was called at the time neo-expressionist kind of painting that emphasized gesture and artistic individuality. These were seen as kind of these older modernist values that were kind of being resurrected at this time, but now as a kind of market commodity. So this caused a lot of hand-wringing amongst leftist critics who lamented the loss or commodification of the sorts of scrappy, experimental, or alternative practices and spaces that characterized the 1970s New York art scene. And here I'm just showing one example of that. This is a work by the choreographer Trisha Brown, Roof Piece, in which 12 dancers are distributed across rooftops in the neighborhood of Soho and are responding to each other's movements. Trisha Brown was one of the founders of the Judson Dance Theater, which was the kind of crucible of experiments in avant-garde dance and the development of kind of postmodern sensibility dance. In this context, Wheatfield appeared as a continuation of those earlier radical energies and resistant to crass market demands. Though it existed only for about 4 months, Wheatfield indeed marks an indelible place within a number of significant movements and categories in late 20th century art. While the New York Times has recently dubbed it a watershed moment in the history of public art in New York, Wheatfield also clearly drew on the legacy of 1960s and 70s land art, large-scale sculpture that was built into, out of, or often incorporated the often remote landscape in which it was situated. It also partook of the interest at the time amongst many artists working in the expanded field of sculpture, partly inspired by land art, for their work to respond to the specificity of its site. And here I'm showing an image of Richard Serre's Tilted Arc, which was installed in Federal Plaza in downtown Manhattan and became super controversial because of the ways it impacted the site, which was exactly Serre's intent, to make the viewer both sort of phenomenologically, visually, spatially aware of the space in a new way, but also to intentionally go against the prescribed social function and meaning of the space. So it was, it wasn't just what is sometimes referred to as plot art, where you just like throw a large-scale sculpture in the space, doesn't matter what it is. It was designed with the space in mind. Another current emerging from land art that Dennis's work in general, but Wheatfield specifically seems to augur, is ecological art. And this is, I just wanted to show another work by Dennis from the early 90s that it was created in the town of Ylöjärvi, Finland. I guarantee that's the correct pronunciation. On the site of an old gravel pit where she had 11,000 people each plant a tree in the formation of the golden ratio, and the land is protected for 400 years. It was commissioned by the UN and the Finnish government. Obviously, this is a genre, ecological art too, that's been gaining more and more attention as a result of the climate emergency. Finally, in retrospect, as an ephemeral work that involved several volunteers in consultation with the city in the planting and harvesting a crop whose yield was later replanted in numerous locations by other individuals, Wheatfield can also be seen as an early example of contemporary artists' interest in social practice, artworks that intervene directly in social processes, systems, or relations. And this is just another example by a Thai artist, Rupert Tirvanit, who's one of the artists most well-known associated with this tendency of social practice emerging from the 90s, that he conceived in Thailand to create a sustainable rice farm in consultation and collaboration with local farmers, but it subsequently involved a number of teams of international well-known artists contributing to it in various ways. So this is kind of an ongoing social project, to just give you an example of this type of art. These overlapping tendencies in Wheatfield have long been characterized as various manifestations of the so-called dematerialization of the art object that occurred starting in the 1960s as artists challenged the notion of artworks as singular static physical objects, typically paintings and sculptures, and instead explored the possibility of artworks as immersive environments, interactive experiences, bodily actions, and immaterial ideas, often in spaces outside traditional art institutions. In fact, the Battery Park landfill had already been the site of such experiments in dematerialization prior to Wheatfield. In 1978, the recently founded arts organization Creative Time began organizing annual events and multimedia installations there as part of a series called Art on the Beach, which continued at the site until 1985. As Creative Time explains it, quote, "The empty tract of land was a choice location due to the grandeur that framed it. The Hudson River, the lower Manhattan skyline, and the twin towers of the World Trade Center. Sprawling sand dunes covered with natural vegetation provided a feeling of being very far from the city while actually remaining in its midst. Thus, the very liminal and provisional nature of the location provided the conditions for artworks that explicitly eschewed permanence and commercialization." Art critic Craig Owens provided the following rather less bucolic description of the site in 1981. "Fragmentary evidence of past human presence has accumulated here. Oxidized I-beams upended in the sand, what seemed like miles of dilapidated snow fencing. Even the sand underfoot seems to testify to some forgotten disaster. Small bits of broken asphalt mixed with the gray sand-like charred remains." Unquote. So rather than empty and unspoiled nature, Owens sees ruins of a past civilization. Here we can detect a very direct connection between the breakdown of the industrial economy and the dematerialization of the art object. That is, just as capital shifted away from manufacturing physical goods and towards more abstract forms of accumulation in the service industries, such as fire, so artists moved away from making unique physical objects and became interested in concepts, information, experiences, and social interactions as art. By 1982, the economy had entered a new phase of dematerialization, what I've called financialization. At its core, this process involves the packaging of future production into value units that are formally equivalent and thus exchangeable: stocks, bonds, options, futures, derivatives, etc. Thus, financialization is basically containerization raised to a higher power of abstraction. This is why situating Wheatfield even more firmly in its historical context is important. Installed quite literally on the burial of dead industry, the work occupied a site that had formerly been the source of capital accumulation for the city during the earlier industrial phase of the economy, while setting itself off against the new existing source of accumulation. The spatio-temporal structure of the work was thus something like actual visible agriculture occurring in the present, juxtaposed against the speculative abstractions of finance. This is, of course, the confrontation identified in virtually every assessment of the work. But what this dramatic clash hides, the term that drops out of this epic encounter, an area that is sort of between Chinatown and Lincoln Heights that had colloquially, historically, actually been referred to as the cornfield, but had previously been a rail yard, starting, I think, in the 1870s, perhaps, and up until really, like, essentially the 1970s and 80s, when deindustrialization also rendered it less useful. But it had been a rail yard for the Southern Pacific Railroad. It was the terminus, and when it was constructed, this really triggered one of the triggers of a major speculation, real estate speculation and population growth boom in Los Angeles, but had obviously, fallen into disuse by the 1990s and was declared a brownfield. Has anyone ever heard that term before, brownfield? Actually, I mean, I've heard it, but I didn't know that it actually was like a specific term that was invented in the 1990s, I think, to refer to like post-industrial spaces that had fallen into disuse and had some kind of obstacle, usually some sort of like hazardous material or pollutant, to further development. But there was an interest in developing those areas. So, I mean, this comes out of a very specific post-industrial context of gentrification at this moment. Obviously, this work, shares a lot of visual, formal, conceptual similarities to something like Agnes Dennis's Wheatfield. But, I mean, the history really of the site, too, it is quite different. And I think that's kind of what is also particularly interesting about this work, because I don't know how many of you, I mean, some of you might actually know this area quite well, but it's a really historically potent site in the history of Los Angeles. I mean, it was originally one of the key sites of one of the main settlements of the Tongva Native Americans in this area. Had a village near this location because it's close to the river. And it is very close to the site then also of the original Pueblo settlement in Los Angeles. And in fact, I think they dug their main irrigation ditch in Los Angeles River right adjacent to this site. So, particularly potent in that sense, but also to the social history of, various immigrant communities and ethnic groups in Los Angeles' history. I mean, it's next to Chinatown, it's next to or adjacent to Chavez Ravine, and if you know the history of displacement there, gentrification from the 1960s or 50s and 60s, and was by the early 2000s started to be an area that was beginning to be targeted by developers and speculators. The difference, though, in this case, and I think this is a really significant difference, is that as a result of actual community organization and activism, they got the site to be bought up by the state, by the California State Parks, instead of going to a private developer who wanted to, I think, maybe build warehouses or something like that there. And so it was, part of the public sphere. But obviously in this context that I'm talking about, where those kinds of distinctions are a little bit blurry. So Lauren Vaughn is actually a trustee of the Annenberg Foundation, which is the philanthropic wing of the Annenberg family fortune. I think she was actually contacted or sought to help fund this project of creating a park here, because there was a sort of interim plan for a smaller scale park here before the kind of larger scale, longer term solution to the park was going to be proposed. And she had this vision to plant an actual cornfield at this site. And so this was great for the state. It would remediate the brownfield space turning the soil into healthy soil rather than toxic. And it involved consultation with local residents, community groups. There were various events here held during this period. Here's some information of some more interesting images here. Okay, so this is while it was obviously being tilled. And here you can see, there's this kind of space that was created with a garden of various crops and sort of in the center of the field. That was a location for a number of different sorts of events. And it also, in some ways, this project was much more in the vein of kind of social practice than something like Wheatfields, and it ended up leading to a number of other sorts of projects and manifestations that Vaughn's been a part of. Here's an aerial view of a kind of later phase in the site. So it was there for an entire harvest cycle from 2005 to 2006. And I just read there was an LA Times article about it, and there were some very interesting nuggets in this article. There was, they interviewed some people, just like local people, and to ask their responses. And someone said, first, if it's industrial or this, I'd rather see this, which is kind of an interesting sort of collapse almost of the historical trajectory of the loss of industry that made this even possible. But there's someone else they interviewed, I think, a local worker, who said, quote, all I see is money. $3 million, you could have bought a Van Gogh for that. You could have put something useful in there. Which, I mean, you kind of want to laugh a little bit at that response, but there's actually, I think, a lot of interesting things going on there. I mean, first of all, you could buy a Van Gogh, or you could put something useful there. It's a weird combination. Also, $3 million is not going to buy a Van Gogh, but just the idea that, all I see is money, right? That when I look at space, when I look at art, when I look at anything, I see money that is the kind of exchange value of these various different things, kind of collapses them together in this way that, I'm seeing starting to really happen in New York in the early 1980s. And so the way that's kind of played out. So yeah, I mean, I'm interested to hear what you guys think about how these works might be similar or different, and generally, if there was anything about Wheatfield that you have questions about. So should we open it up? Maybe? Yeah.
It's not specifically about these two, but particularly as you presented on Cornfield. To go back to Michigan, this makes me think a lot about Detroit. So I'm just thinking about the way in which you're describing, like, kind of really since 1960s, like 80s processes, 90s processes, and then in Detroit, sort of the last 10, 15 years, and the way in which some of these processes are replicating in that context, except that the way in which sort of urban gardening, urban agriculture is being used in these different ways in the landscape, part of sort of the bog center and this history of civil rights and racial justice work that's been going on for a really long time, and sort of self-determination of communities versus the idea of because of just the sort of the white flight that happened and has happened in various ways over time, and the ways in which city planners are well, we should just turn this into agricultural space, right? So it's kind of being squeezed from both sides because of the loss of population. So positioning urban agriculture as something that is grassroots, but then as something that's part of planning, while Dan Gilbert is just buying everything and developing it downtown. So I wondered about, had you kind of thought about, this is sort of beyond the realm of art, the way that you're describing it, but thinking about those types of landscape
Yeah. No, totally. I mean, Detroit is such an amazing comparison. I mean, for one, it's like the quintessential industrial city and post-industrial. I mean, I would never call it a wasteland, but that's the kind of myth, right? And so one of the processes in Detroit is the like prairification, where you have these empty lots of buildings that have been demolished, and it starts to resemble just like nature, weeds, trees, and stuff growing. And that creates these surreal contrasts in this like organic way, which is interesting to think about. I don't know what.
And then the ways in which that's been photographed.
Right. Yeah.
As well.
Exactly.
So
Growing corn.
myth.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. But yeah, now I mean, you probably know more about this than I do. The farming, the urban farming that's been going on there. I think, yeah, you're absolutely. It's like that itself has become like a struggle over who it's for, and can you do this without it being speculative or fueling the interests of gentrification, which is kind of one of the bigger questions I want to consider. I'm always thinking about, like, can you have, in the neoliberal era, can you have investment without gentrification? Like, is that possible? And, this is, I think, is what communities and working class residents in these neighborhoods are fighting over. Because of course they want investment in these neighborhoods that have been, completely disinvested from, haven't seen any type of economic activity. But is there a way to do that without it, being in the interest of the market and developers and displacing residents? So yeah, I mean Detroit, it's like an amazing study. Yeah.
Were these places, I don't know if you know the answer to this, but I'm wondering if these places were like tested for lead before?
So back in Park City, the soil was toxic and couldn't grow, and so they put I think it was maybe a foot of soil, topsoil over it to grow the wheat in, and that was trucked in. I think also, I'm pretty sure that for the not a cornfield, they had to truck in dirt to cover this space. But I think, at least in the case of not a cornfield, because it was going to be turned into a park, the growing of the corn there helped detoxify and put nutrients in the soil. So that was part of the intention of it. So I don't know specifically of lead. I'm pretty sure there was arsenic and other toxins in the area in Los Angeles. Yeah.
Do you know what happened to the corn?
Yeah, so that's an interesting part of the story. After it was harvested, and this is like one of the interesting contradictions, because I think in a lot of ways, not a cornfield is in some ways a kind of more, I don't want to use the term conscious, but it sort of involves or thinks about the kind of varied states. But after it was harvested, they stored it in an adjacent building for a while that became her studio, and that involved having to evict a homeless encampment that was on that location. So at that site where the corn was stored. And part of it was turned into these bales that became a sculpture at the site that was then seeded with wildflowers and other local flora. So yeah, that's good. Yeah.
So no one ever ate it? Or was it just stored?
Sorry, what?
Did anyone ever eat the corn?
No, yeah, that was another difference. Is I think it was not edible, and it was purely decorative. I think the corn was not
If it was used for bioremediation, it would be healthy.
Yeah.
Thank you for a really rich talk. It was nice it was really exciting to see you give a talk after But I have two questions, and if you'll forgive me, I'm going to ask you to go back in your slide.
Yeah.
So the first one is pretty short, but it relates to the first image of Battery Park City. which you showed that was like 19, I don't know, 75, but, and you don't have to pull it up, but it looked to me.
This one?
No, of the planning of the.
Oh,
the
yeah.
The housing development, et cetera.
This one.
Yeah, this looks uncannily like the High Line.
Right.
And Zaha Hadid's new building.
Yeah.
And so I was curious if you knew whether this was actually kind of like sourced in the planning, particularly of Zaha Hadid's structure.
I don't know, but the High Line and Hadid's work in general, and a lot of contemporary architects, there was like a trend in the, I don't know when it started, I don't know, it's not about architecture, but I know that this idea of megastructure, which was so associated with these kind of 1960s visionary projects, most of which never got built, made this kind of weird simulacral return in over the past 10, maybe 20 years or so. So yeah, the idea of this multi-purpose, multi-use, public-private, crazy, large, systemic, sustainable, all these kinds of.
But decidedly not low-income housing.
Of course, yeah, obviously, yeah. I mean, that term itself isn't even used anymore. It's affordable housing, which just signals that it's a market-based. Yeah.
I mean, it just kind of dawned on me the irony of the monumental architectural structures now, and how her piece was so much kind of in flux or in conversation anti that, but now this huge show that opened today is in one of these monumental structures that looks just like what was to be built there. But
I
mean, the shed is that,
that's a great point.
next to the honeycomb, which is looks like that, is now in the show.
Yeah, so the shed, which is this new giant space for contemporary, maybe performance-based works, but is where the Dennis show is now. Huge project that has involved very shady and controversial forms of some privatization and kind of taxpayer-funded subsidies that have gone to overruns, as so many projects in Bloomberg here have been. It is, totally this kind of megastructure model, and very futuristic too in the ways that it's working.
So I have less a question and two historical touchstones that my eyes are sort of seeing. So I'm thinking of Antonio Santovio, and I look at that.
Futuristic.
Which is really interesting to think about Italian futurism and the kind of, sort of industrialization and then sort of like the eviction of the human in favor of the machine.
Yeah.
Which is kind of interesting. I mean, I don't know about these people, but it seems like they might be looking at that. And then, of course, Archigram and things like that.
Yeah.
But the other one, and maybe you know this, but Sami Siegelbaum in 1933 did a monument to the plow in land in the Great Plains that was taken out of production for wheat. And he hired, it was a huge pyramid, and he basically hired out of work farm workers because of the, there was an increase in wheat production in the 30s. And so they had to basically, with the Depression, they had to bring the price down, and they basically took a step out of production. And he hired all these farm workers to actually plant the wheat, or this was the idea, it was never built. But it was basically like land art in 1933 that was funded by the US government. I mean, that was the Imagine.
Yeah.
So it's another touchstone. I talk about it a lot. There's a chapter about it in my Gucci book.
Oh,
So it was so interesting to think about that historical relationship between, and it was all about the urban and the rural, but it was a much more 1930s kind of opposition.
Was it projected to be a WPA thing, or?
Yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can I jump back in? Because my second question.
Oh, you're fine.
No, not at all. But I wanted to ask you actually about how you were thinking about, or even struggling with notions of history in putting the talk together, because you gave us a super tight account of shifts of capital, but then also the further along in your talk you got, And for me, it was triggered first by the image a couple slides later of the dirt and then the Statue of Liberty that's in the corner. And that to me raised the specter of colonialism and this kind of question of like, how do you, like when you were developing the project, like how were you thinking about your historical starting point, even if it's a heuristic, not this one, I think it's earlier.
Oh, this one, very nice, this one.
Yeah. So, if these pieces in some ways are reminding us of the land and the lander, right? And like if indigeneity is about the relationship to the land and they're kind of calling back to the much longer history of financialization, right? Then like where do you cut yourself off, or like how do you like is capital sufficient to account of what you're talking about, or is it colonialism, or what kind of critique?
Yeah, so that's a really good point. And I do think I see it in what for me is the long history of capitalism, that of course colonialism is an essential part of. And particularly, I mean, these works in the United States, and I think what's so crucial to remember about colonialism and its relationship to land in particular is that it's not just the dispossession or transference of land from the native population to the colonizers, but it's actually the transformation of land into property. And that is really the process of enclosure that is part of colonialism, which is happening consequently to, or in many instances in parallel to, the enclosure of the commons in Europe, which is triggering the Industrial Revolution. So yeah, definitely, I mean, financialization is not something that starts for the first time, of course, in the 1970s or 80s. It's part of these cycles. So yeah, that's a really great point. And it's interesting to think too, I think, in relation to landscape, because landscape as an artistic genre itself actually emerges in response to enclosure and the aestheticization of property of the land itself arises at that moment too. Painters making paintings of like people's estates and things like that, or in the settler colonial expansion in North America of kind of picturing the sublime Western landscape as like empty and just like expansive and beautiful. So I think these works are operating in those licenses to a landscape as an aesthetic phenomenon too. So yeah, that's really interesting. Any other questions? Did any of you guys, I mean, some of you may have not been here, but did anyone see the Not a Cornfield at the time? Yeah. Did you? It was like right when I moved to Los Angeles, so I don't remember. I remember, I think it was basically returned to just like empty space after that, because the financial crash hit right after that, and so it really put the brakes on the creation of the park for a while. So that's what I remember.
Where she did that project, wasn't there something, water mill or something with water in the same space?
Yeah.
Or went away, she continued to do projects
In that site? Yeah, well, I think the like monument created from the bales might have been part of that too. That were like growing gardens or whatever space. But I know also another part of the story is that the city demanded that she return the site to its pre-cornfield state, which meant actually like killing all of it, like spraying it with Roundup and like retoxifying it basically before they made the current part Los Angeles State Historic Park.
So I actually remember walking through it, and one of the things that was really, I think I might even have some old videos, like somewhere. There were so many insects in the corn, and this was the thing that it's kind of, you wouldn't see this in the photographs, right? But there was so much sound, and the insects were going crazy with the corn, and the corn was like it was dark red, like it was a very, like old corn stalk. Like historically, it wasn't a hybrid, it was like some kind of, so it was red and brown and like, yeah, non-GMO corn. And the insects were going insane, like pollinating. And it was loud and there were lots of them. And so it's kind of interesting to think about how the corn also interacted with the insect community. So in terms of the ecological aspect, it's a little bit, because the corn dealing with works is that really intensified insect pollination, but it seemed like it brought all these insects to this place that had just obviously not had insects to do with like train tracks and creosote and arsenic and oil and whatever was left over from the trains, you know? So that was a very powerful part of the experience of walking through it.
Yeah, I think that was part of the intent too.
Yeah.
Something else I forgot to mention too is there were actually, I think maybe before it was up and running, when the project had been announced, there were protests actually from local community groups who felt that this was like a vanity project by an artist who wasn't part of the community and was, you know, they had been promised a park, a public park, and they were going to get this cornfield, so there was some controversy over it too at the time, which I think again kind of raises the issues about site-specific art as it's not just a physical space,